The committee will come to order. Today's hearing is an important opportunity to discuss the wide range of threats facing our nation. I'm grateful that our top national security and law enforcement officials are here with us this morning to provide critical updates about what their agencies are doing to address threats to the homeland. This year, this hearing comes at a crucial moment. We are seeing a heightened threat environment in communities across the country in reaction to the ongoing conflict between Hamas and Israel. Many Americans are fearful of that increased tensions around the conflict could lead to violence in their communities here at home as incidents of anti-Semitic, anti-Arab, and anti-Muslim hate continues to grow. Terrorism, and in particular domestic terrorism, fueled by white supremacist and anti-government ideologies, remains one of the most serious threats to our homeland security. And I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today about how their agencies are working to address both international as well as domestic terrorism. Our nation also faces emerging threats from biological, chemical, nuclear, and radiological weapons, especially if those weapons fall into the wrong hands. I have long been concerned about the danger this poses, which is why I led the effort to reauthorize the Office of Countering Weapons of Mass Destruction and will continue to work towards that end. We must also reauthorize the Chemical Facility Anti-Terrorism Standards Program and ensure that facilities that store or produce chemicals are secure from terrorist threats. We'll also discuss the significant threat that cyber attacks pose to our national and economic security. Bad actors such as foreign agents from China and Russia, cyber criminals and so-called hacktivist groups are constantly adapting, posing a serious risk to our critical infrastructure and to our election security. I am proud of the bipartisan work that this committee has done to strengthen American cybersecurity. Our bipartisan reforms are helping to protect schools, federal agencies, state and local governments, and other targets from cyber attacks. That said, there is a whole lot more we must do to stop criminal hackers and foreign adversaries from exploiting network vulnerabilities, and I look forward to discussing those topics here today. The use of unmanned aircraft systems in our country has also rapidly increased, and while these tools help our economy and law enforcement personnel, they also bring serious security risk. Drones can threaten manned aircraft operations, target large public gatherings, and even be used to transport contraband across our borders. I look forward to hearing what our witnesses have to say about the threat of unmanned aircraft systems and the urgent need to reauthorize the counter-UAS capacities of the federal government, which are set to expire later in November. One of the most serious challenges we face, and one of the toughest to tackle, is that of climate change and natural disasters. This is an existential threat to our planet and continues to affect our national security. As extreme weather events become more common, we have to spend more resources on disaster recovery. Climate change also poses direct threats to our security infrastructure, affecting ports, manufacturing facilities, transportation routes, and many other parts of our supply chains. Today, we'll hear more about how our national security agencies are addressing climate change and what else we must do to mitigate this threat. And finally, this hearing presents a unique opportunity to discuss border security. As we learn more about the administration's work to secure our northern and southern borders, prevent human trafficking, and stop the flow of deadly drugs like fentanyl into our communities. The full range of these threats, from terrorism to drones to climate change, pose great danger to our communities, and our panel of witnesses will provide an essential perspective. They will help us understand what our agencies are doing to mitigate these national security threats and what more Congress and the administration can do to keep every American safe. I look forward to a very productive discussion. Ranking Member Paul, you are recognized for your opening remarks.
In 1976, the Church Committee issued its final report, revealing decades of widespread abuse by federal intelligence agencies against U.S. citizens. The bipartisan Church Committee outlined countless examples of how the federal government used powers that were meant to counter foreign threats against its own citizens. In an effort to protect society, these abuses happened under presidents of both parties. Domestic groups like the NAACP and the Women's Liberation Group engaged in nonviolent, lawful political expression were targeted and surveilled for contradicting the approved government initiative and narrative. Intelligence agencies use their powers to serve ideological purposes, attempting to covertly influence social policy and political action. The government distorted and exaggerated facts, leveraged mass media, and attacked the leadership of groups it considered to be threats to the social order. One of these so-called threats to social order was Martin Luther King Jr. The purpose of the Church Committee's years-long investigation was to expose the intelligence agency's unlawful overreach into the private lives of Americans. The committee hoped that its findings would result in more transparency and accountability to ensure that these abuses never occurred again. They say history repeats itself, doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. Unfortunately, as we sit here today, I fear that our federal government is still undertaking many of the same tactics that the Church Committee found to be unworthy of democracy and occasionally reminiscent of totalitarian regimes. Federal agencies, including the FBI and the DHS, continue to operate in a manner that is outside the scope of their authorities, wasting taxpayer dollars and infringing on the rights of Americans. Earlier this month, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals found that the federal agencies, including the FBI and DHS, likely violated the First Amendment. In fact, the judge said it was one of the worst, if not the worst, violation of the First Amendment in American history. By coercing social media companies to remove speech the government disagreed with related to the origins of COVID-19, pandemic lockdowns, vaccine efficacy, and the Hunter Biden laptop stories. FBI and DHS regularly met with social media companies and pressured them to remove content it deemed as misinformation, including posts and accounts that originated from within the United States and including posts and accounts that are verifiably true. And the censorship of the constitutionally protected speech on social media is just one example of the executive branch actions in recent years weaponizing the federal government against its people. The FBI continues to misuse its authority under Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. You would think we'd be going after foreigners, but we are using the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act to go after Americans, as we observed and was done with individuals participating in the George Floyd protests. Unconstitutional access to Americans' activities was instituted against those in the George Floyd protests. DHS warned of violence from Americans who questioned the efficacy and safety of the COVID-19 vaccines and protested government overreach associated with pandemic mitigation measures. These agencies, charged with protecting the security of our nation, targeted parents who protested restrictive COVID-19 policies at school board meetings and labeled Catholics as potential domestic terrorists. It is hardly a surprise that the faith of Americans in their government is dwindling. Instead of focusing on rampant violent crime across the nation and the unprecedented crisis at the border, FBI and DHS are using their resources to surveil and censor law-abiding Americans engaged in constitutionally protected speech. When the federal government's activities are improperly focused inward, legitimate national security threats go unnoticed. The Church Committee highlighted the important point, highlighting that the FBI placed more emphasis on domestic dissent than on organized crime. And its effort to combat foreign spies suffered because of its focus on American protest groups. The narratives from the past and the present draw a concerning parallel. The lessons of the Church Committee report resonate nearly 50 years later, yet the cycle of executive branch overreach continues. The American people deserve accountability from the federal government, and Congress cannot continue to abdicate its constitutional duty to conduct oversight. As the Church Committee aptly pointed out, power must be checked and balanced, and the preservation of liberty requires the restraint of laws. It is our responsibility to ensure that the principles of American democracy endure, and I hope my colleagues on both sides of the aisle will work with me to do just that.
It is the practice of the Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee to swear in witnesses. So if each of our witnesses would please stand and raise your right hand. Do you swear the testimony you will give before this committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Thank you. You may be seated. Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas is the 7th Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security. Secretary Mayorkas has led a distinguished career over 3 decades as a law enforcement official and a lawyer in the private sector. He has served as the department's Deputy Secretary, as Director of U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, and at the Department of Justice as Assistant United States Attorney in the Central District of California. Secretary Mayorkas, thank you for appearing before our committee once again. You are recognized for your opening statement.
Chairman Peters, Ranking Member Paul, distinguished members of this committee. In September, the Department of Homeland Security published the 2024 Homeland Threat Assessment, laying out the most direct, pressing threats to our security. Already, in the weeks since the assessment was published, the world has changed. Hamas terrorists horrifically attacked thousands of innocent men, women, and children in Israel on October 7th, brutally murdering, wounding, and taking hostages of all ages. In the days and weeks since, we have responded to an increase in threats against Jewish, Muslim, and Arab American communities and institutions across our country. Hate directed at Jewish students, communities, and institutions add to a pre-existing increase in the level of anti-Semitism in the United States and around the world. As the last few weeks have shown, the threat environment our department is charged with confronting has evolved and expanded constantly in the 20 years since our founding after 9/11. Today, individuals radicalized to violence can terrorize using a vehicle or a firearm. A transnational criminal organization needs only to conceal 2.2 pounds of fentanyl in a commercial truck or passenger car crossing through our land port of entry to kill as many as 500,000 people. Lone actors in nation states such as Russia, Iran, and the People's Republic of China can use computer code to steal sensitive personal information, shut down critical infrastructure, and extort millions in ransom payments. Compromising deepfake images can exploit and ruin the life of a young person. Extreme heat, wildfires, and devastating hurricanes are increasing in frequency and severity. And our department's founding rationale, the threat posed by foreign terrorists using weapons of mass destruction, remains. The 260,000 men and women of the Department of Homeland Security work every day to mitigate these threats and many more. I am immensely proud to be here today on their behalf to discuss the work they do, the challenges they face, and most importantly, the support they require from Congress to do their jobs. Thank you for the opportunity to do so. I would like to focus today on 2 such means of critical, urgent support. First, Congress must not allow key DHS authorities to lapse. Our department's authority to implement the Chemical Facility Anti-Terrorism Standards expired on July 28th. That means the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency is barred from inspecting over 3,000 high-risk chemical facilities, identifying who is accessing them and whether they are stockpiling dangerous chemicals. Historically, more than a third of inspections identify at least one gap in a facility's security. Our counter-drone authority will expire on November 18th, challenging, among other missions, the Secret Service's ability to protect the President and Vice President, and Customs and Border Protection's ability to patrol the southwest border and intercept cartel drones ferrying drugs and other contraband through the air. Our department's Office of Countering Weapons of Mass Destruction Authority will expire on December 21st. That would hinder our ability to detect biological and illicit nuclear material threats and safeguard against the use of AI in the development of biological weapons, as President Biden charged us with doing yesterday in his executive order on artificial intelligence. Finally, key elements of our intelligence collection authority under Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act will expire on December 31st. Expiration would leave our country vulnerable to attacks supported by American citizens, and it would cripple our ability to identify and secure American citizens who are the targets of such attacks. Renewing each of these four authorities is common sense, bipartisan, and critical to our national security. This is not a moment to let our country's guard down. Second, we need Congress to allocate sufficient resources to enable our nation's frontline officers to carry out their difficult jobs and keep the American people safe. 2 weeks ago, our administration requested critical supplemental Homeland Security funding that would help do just that. This funding package would allow us to more effectively combat the scourge of fentanyl, stem the impacts of historic migration, and accelerate work authorization for eligible non-citizens. This funding will, in short, make a critical difference in our department's operational capacity and in our national security. Ensuring the safety of the American people is a national imperative and a governmental obligation. I look forward to partnering with Congress to deliver for the men and women who keep our country safe. I look forward to working with you to address the threats and challenges America faces today and in the years to come. And I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Director Christopher Wray is the 8th Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Director Wray began his law enforcement career over 2 decades ago, serving in the Department of Justice as an Assistant U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of Georgia. He has also served on the President's Corporate Tax Fraud Force and supervised the Enron Tax Force, in addition to playing a key role in national security objectives for the Department. Director Wray, so welcome back to the committee for your testimony here today. You're recognized for your opening statements.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Peters, Ranking Member Paul, members of the committee. Discussions about the most pressing national security threats, that what we face and what we're doing to tackle them, are always important, but it seems especially well-timed this year with the dangerous implications the very fluid situation in the Middle East has for our homeland security. The reality is that the terrorism threat has been elevated throughout 2023, but the ongoing war in the Middle East has raised the threat of an attack against Americans in the United States to a whole nother level. Since the horrific terrorist attacks committed by Hamas against innocent people in Israel a few weeks ago, we've been working around the clock to support our partners there and to protect Americans here at home. We assess that the actions of Hamas and its allies will serve as an inspiration, the likes of which we haven't seen since ISIS launched its so-called caliphate several years ago. In just the past few weeks, multiple foreign terrorist organizations have called for attacks against Americans and the West. Al-Qaeda issued its most specific call to attack the United States in the last 5 years. ISIS urged its followers to target Jewish communities in the United States and Europe. Hezbollah has publicly expressed its support for Hamas and threatened to attack U.S. interests in the Middle East. And we've seen an increase in attacks on U.S. military bases overseas carried out by militia groups backed by Iran. Here in the United States, our most immediate concern is that violent extremists, individuals or small groups, will draw inspiration from the events in the Middle East to carry out attacks against Americans going about their daily lives. That includes not just homegrown violent extremists inspired by a foreign terrorist organization, but also domestic violent extremists targeting Jewish or Muslim communities. We've already seen that with the individual we arrested last week in Houston, who'd been studying how to build bombs and posted online about his support for killing Jews. And with the tragic killing of a 6-year-old Muslim boy in Illinois in what we're investigating as a federal hate crime. But as I said a few moments ago, on top of the homegrown violent extremists and domestic violent extremist threat, we also cannot and do not discount the possibility that Hamas or another foreign terrorist organization may exploit the current conflict to conduct attacks here on our own soil. We have kept our sights on Hamas and have multiple ongoing investigations into individuals affiliated with that foreign terrorist organization. And while historically our Hamas cases have identified individuals located here who are facilitating and financing Hamas's terrorism overseas, we're continuing to scrutinize our intelligence to assess how the threat may be evolving. But it's not just Hamas. As the world's largest state sponsor of terrorism, the Iranians, for instance, have directly or by hiring criminals mounted assassination attempts against dissidents and high-ranking current and former U.S. government officials, including right here on American soil. And along those lines, Hezbollah, Iran's primary strategic partner, has a history of seeding operatives and infrastructure, obtaining money and weapons, and spying in this country going back years. Given that disturbing history, we are keeping a close eye on what impact recent events may have on those groups' intentions here in the United States and how those intentions might evolve. For example, the cyber targeting of American interests and critical infrastructure that we already see conducted by Iran and non-state actors alike, we can expect to get worse if the conflict expands, as will the threat of kinetic attacks. But across the country, in each and every one of the FBI's 56 field offices, we are addressing these threats with a sense of urgency. Among other things, that means working closely with our federal, state, and local partners through our FBI-led Joint Terrorism Task Forces to ensure that together we stay laser-focused on mitigating threats, taking an even closer look at existing investigations and canvassing our sources to improve our intelligence, and then sharing that information with our partners, and doing all we can, working with our partners, to protect all houses of worship and people of all faiths here in the U.S. Bottom line, we're going to continue to do everything in our power to protect the American people and support our partners in Israel. Now, protecting Americans from the threat of terrorism is and remains our #1 priority. But as you all know, the range of threats we battle each and every day is enormous. From cyber attacks to economic espionage to violent crime and narcotics trafficking and everything in between. And none of the problems we tackle is getting any easier. But we have continued to work to outpace our adversaries by disrupting over 40% more cyber operations last year and arresting over 60% more cyber criminals than the year before. We're aggressively working to protect America's economic security from China's relentless efforts to steal our innovation and intellectual property, with around 2,000 active investigations across all 56 FBI field offices. And over the past 2 years alone, we've seized enough fentanyl to kill 270 million people. That's more than 80% of all Americans. Now, I am incredibly proud of the FBI's 38,000 skilled and dedicated professionals who tackle these complex challenges to protect their fellow Americans, which leads me to my final point. I think it is our shared responsibility to make sure that the FBI's men and women have the tools they need to keep us all safe. And indispensable in that toolkit against foreign adversaries are the FBI's FISA 702 authorities. It would be absolutely devastating if the next time an adversary like Iran or China conducts a major cyber attack, we don't see it coming because 702, one of our most important tools, was allowed to lapse. Or with everything going on in the world, imagine if a foreign terrorist overseas directs an operative to carry out an attack here on our own backyard, but we're not able to disrupt it because the FBI's authorities have been so watered down. So I'm happy to talk more about all the things the FBI has done in the last few years to make sure we are good stewards of our vital 702 authorities. But I want to close by thanking you again for having me here today, and I'm happy to answer any questions